Excuse me there, Mr. Bailey.
Hi Jack, what's wrong?
I was just out in golf just then, and I'm really struggling with my full swing that we have to do for the end of semester assessment. Is there any chance you can help me, please?
Well, it is lunchtime now. Why didn't you ask me during class just then?
Well, I was just in there and I'm really struggling in class, and I thought people would laugh at me because I've never done anything like this before and I'm pretty bad, to be honest.
Well, I do have playground duty in 10 minutes, so I've got to be really quick. So what I'll do, I'll get a film of you, then I'll take it back to the HP staff room where I'll have a few other teachers have a look at it and we'll do a further analysis there. Does that sound helpful?
Yeah, that's good, thank you.
Alright, we'll go have a look.
A full swing in golf can be divided into 5 separate phases: the setup, the backswing, the downswing, ball impact, and the follow-through. Fluently transitioning between the phases is critical towards ensuring an optimal golf shot is produced. The first sequential phase of the golf swing is the setup. In order to successfully sequence and time the rest of the swing phases together, there is a heavy reliance on the setup phase being successful. The setup phase of the swing effectively takes place once the hitter begins to optimize their body position to improve their balance and hitting stability. This optimal body position is typically achieved via a neutral grip, a balanced body weight distribution with knees shoulder width apart, a parallel positioning of the body and the target, and finally by bending the knees. The bending of the knees is a vital step towards lowering one's center of gravity, providing the hitter with a balanced stance, strong stability, an equally proportioned body weight, and an increased base of support. The greater the base of support, the more balanced and stable the hitter will be in their swing, which will produce a more effective shot. Enhanced stability, also known as equilibrium, is attained as knee flexion positions the body's center of gravity over the base of support. Another key component is the setup phase, is standing with the knees approximately shoulder width apart. Positioning the knees shoulder width apart increases the hitter's base of support, which promotes hitting stability and balance. Ensuring these vital components are satisfied will have a positive influence on the remaining 4 phases, allowing more force and club head velocity to be generated. In terms of Newton's second law of force equals mass times acceleration formula, a fluent setup phase with efficient balance and stability will increase the efficiency of a hitter optimizing their distance, accuracy, and overall outcome of the shot. In close relation to Newton's second law of acceleration is his third law of equal and opposite reaction. In the setup phase, the reaction occurring between the hitter's legs and the force of the ground, bending of the knees provides the hitter with a forceful reaction that is vital in producing acceleration for the commencement of the backswing. The movement required for the setup phase is linear in motion, occurring once the hitter travels downwards from a standing upright position to a balanced setup with their knees flexed. This flexion of the knee and hip joints is generated along the sagittal plane and the longitudinal axis. Along with the freezing of these third-class levers, a lever being a bar or rigged structure that pivots around a fixed point, head and neck flexion also occurs on the sagittal plane around the frontal axis as the hitter looks down at the golf ball.
After the setup phase is established, the backswing stage follows. Timing coupled with sequencing of body parts to summate force is crucial in this stage. Large amounts of force are summated by sequencing the movement of large body parts and progress to smaller body parts. 2 simultaneous movements occur when the sequence commences. These movements occur along either side of the transverse plane, which is the plane dividing the top half of the body from the bottom half. The first movement on the inferior half of the body starts with the clockwise rotation of the hip and knee joint. This external rotation of the 2 joints happens along either side of the vertical axis of rotation to allow for a more powerful downswing phase. As the hip and knees rotate, the center of gravity shifts. From the stance, the center of gravity is located straight down the body. However, when the external rotation of the 2 joints takes place, the center of gravity shifts laterally more towards the back foot because of the change in weight distribution. As the rotation of the hip joint takes place, the external obliques, latissimus dorsi, and pectorals all slightly externally rotate in the superior part of the body. The second simultaneous movement, which occurs in the superior part of the body, begins with the 3rd degree lever. A lever is a rigid structure which is hinged at one point with forces being applied at either end. Biomechanically, bones act as levers, with joints being the fulcrum point where the rotation occurs. Despite there being 3 lever classes, 3rd class levers are most applicable to the backswing phase. The arms are the third-class levers in golf due to the fulcrum positioned at the shoulder joint, the load being the golf club, and the motive force coming from the midsection of the arm. In the backswing, torque, which is the ability to create movement on a lever, produces a slight internal rotation of the shoulder joint, so that the palm of the hand is facing inwards towards the body. This rotation allows for a maximum range of motion in the lead arm. The lead arm stays straight as torque produces the lead arm to abduct vertically in a circular motion. This abduction occurs in the frontal plane, which separates the body from the front to back. At a certain point, the trail arm flexes to allow maximum rotation and helps with the abduction in the lead arm. This flexion occurs around the sagittal plane, which divides the body from left to right. The trail arm shoulder also externally rotates away from the body, allowing for a wider hip rotation. As the lead arm abducts, torque produces slight turn of the wrist inwards. This radial deviation of the wrist causes the golf club to be positioned just above the head and almost adjacent to the ground. Maximum rotation occurs when the lead arm can no longer rotate.
The aim of the downswing is to achieve maximum velocity of the club head towards the ball, without shifting the swing outside the correct plane of motion. The swing occurs in the transverse plane as it is rotary movement of the upper body. This phase is initiated by the activation of the hip abductor muscles, gluteus maximus, and by the rotation of the trunk. This rotation motion brings the trunk and hips towards the target line of the swing and works simultaneously with the descent of the arms. The right arm produces an adduction motion across the frontal plane, which works to produce maximum force and generate acceleration of the club head. During the descent of the arms and extension of the elbow, the weight is transferred laterally to the front foot. This weight transference not only results in greater force and acceleration generated, but also improves the accuracy of the shot. Through the first stage of this phase, the wrist remains cocked until the left forearm reaches a horizontal position. After this, the wrist begins to unload, which brings the forearm and club to 180 degrees upon impact. This uncocking of the wrist increases the acceleration and the angular momentum of the swing, which ultimately generates a greater force upon impact. This can be linked to Newton's second law of motion, which states the relationship between force and acceleration through the formula of force equals mass times acceleration. The sequential ordering of muscles and joints is pivotal in generating angular momentum. This is described as a summation of forces, whereby momentum is moved from the large body parts, such as the legs, trunk, and shoulders, to the final muscles and joints, such as the arms and wrist, prior to making contact of the golf ball. The golf swing acts as a third-class lever, whereby the shoulder joint represents the fulcrum, the force is produced by the movement of the arms, and resistance is the club head. In order to produce maximum velocity upon impact, it is essential to gain the greatest length of the lever arm. To do this, the force being generated must be as far away from the axis of rotation as possible. Therefore, the arms must extend out during the downswing, as it brings the force produced further away from the shoulder joint. This ultimately increases the production of torque, which generates a greater amount of force upon impact of the ball.
After observing Jack's swing, a key flaw in his setup phase was clearly apparent. Jack, having only been introduced to golf for the first time in year 11, has limited experience performing this motor program, and as a result, has not yet refined his technique. This is evident as Jack stands up tall in his setup, not flexing his knees, and therefore not promoting a balanced and stable stance for his full swing. This basic but common error, as well as the footage showing us Jack failing to hit the ball consistently, provides us with an easy indication of Jack being in the beginning stages of assembling the coordination pattern of the golf swing. He's therefore at stage 1 of Newell's model of adaptive behaviour. As highlighted by Jack himself, this is the first time he has participated in any sport like golf, and like typically seen in a beginner golf player, Jack does not possess the ability to freeze his degrees of freedom in the optimal position, in this case, his knee and hip joints. This problem is of particular relevance biomechanically, as without this knee flexion, Jack will not have a stable base of support or the low centre of gravity required for a balanced, stable, and successful full swing. It is therefore top priority that Jack addresses this problem in order for him to obtain the A he wishes to achieve for his school golf assessment. Although there are weaknesses evident in Jack's swing, a reinforcing strength can also be observed in his setup. A key element that Jack demonstrates success in his setup phase is the positioning of his knees shoulder width apart.
Despite this not seeming like a major point, this positive aspect of his stance directly links to the promotion of a large base of support, a lower centre of gravity, and consequently a stable and balanced swing, which are all common elements of a successful golf swing. Via the adoption of the constraints-led approach, which fosters a non-linear pedagogy approach, and Carr's goal setting, both Jack's strength and weaknesses will hopefully improve.
After analysing the backswing stage of Jack's golf swing, a number of weaknesses were observable. In the backswing stage specifically, the predominant problem was the production of insufficient rotation on the latter stages of his backswing. The result is a deficiency in wrist torque generation to produce a sharp radial deviation, which helps position the golf club in the ideal set location just above his head. Optimizing the rotation on the backswing is crucial to the setup of the generation of power for the downswing stage. Currently, Jack's lead arm falls well short of being in line with his shoulders, with no rotation evident at all. Rotation generally occurs once the lead arm has reached shoulder height, with the optimal position of the golf club being positioned close to behind the head. The reason for Jack's insufficient rotation in his backswing is due to Jack restricting his degrees of freedom when trying to create vertical shoulder rotation. Once his lead shoulder joint has reached a certain height, Jack has a tendency to freeze his lead arm, which limits the range of movement visible in his swing. Jack can be categorized as being in the first stage of Newell's model of motor learning, which is assembling a coordination pattern stage. This is due to the fact that although Jack has some basic movement pattern required for the backswing stage of golf, his novice movement and inability to interact with the perceptual motor landscape, which in this case is strategic goals associated with the backswing stage, is inadequate and needs attention. Jack, however, does have some good tendencies, such as keeping his lead arm straight, which is important for the generation of power for the later phase of the swing.
Through the use of video analysis programs and first-hand evidence, it is seen that Jack consistently tops the ball or misses it completely with each swing. This issue is due to the premature extension of Jack's hips and spine, which ultimately raises Jack's centre of gravity. This therefore alters Jack's base of support, which then leads to Jack lacking stabilisation throughout his swing. The vertical movement of his centre of gravity also limits knee flexion, further adding to the instability of the swing. The changed centre of gravity will also increase the distance that is between the club head and the ball, making it almost impossible to cleanly strike the ball upon impact. In conjunction with this problem, Jack also rotates his neck. This further creates greater difficulty for Jack to make contact with the ball, with the sweet spot of the club. For Jack to increase his accuracy and distance when hitting, he must ensure he keeps his head and neck steady. By keeping his eye on the ball throughout his downswing, he should be able to correctly transfer his weight and limit the lifting of the club head. Through further analysing Jack's swing, it can be assumed that Jack does not possess the ability to freeze the degrees of freedom in the optimal hip position, resulting in early hip movement and spine extension. As a result of this, Jack transfers a large proportion of his weight to his back leg instead of ideally transferring his momentum through to his front foot. This limited sway of momentum greatly affects Jack's summation of forces during his downswing. The forces generated by Jack's upper body are not successfully mirrored to his legs and therefore limits the momentum of his swing. The reduced summation of forces creates a decreased amount of acceleration produced throughout the downswing, resulting in a much smaller force hitting the ball upon impact. The array of problems that Jack is having with his swing shows that he is within stage 1 of Newell's model of adaptive behaviour, as he is in the beginning stages of assembling a coordination pattern. A key area that Jack exhibits success is the acceleration at which his hands travel down the vertical axis of rotation. It is evident that in Jack's downswing, the acceleration gets greater as his club gets closer to making contact on the ball. This positive aspect increases the likelihood of keeping the club face on the same line as the ball, which ultimately increases the accuracy of the shot and also the force behind it. Throughout the adoption of the constraints-led approach, whereby non-linear pedagogy approach is fostered, as well as Carr's goal setting, both Jack's weaknesses and strengths will hopefully show improvement.
There are a number of constraints that could be applied to addressing Jack's issue of his straight knees in his setup. However, before these can be applied, there must be a way of measuring his success first. Prior to and after the implementation of the constraints, an effective process of measuring Jack's improvement is via the process of establishing specific targets and goals. with specific reference to Carr's model of task and goal setting, an acronym short for challenging, attainable, realistic, and specific. Jack has expressed his overall outcome goal as achieving an A at the end of term golf swing assessment in 10 weeks. Therefore, his target skill is to hit a successfully lofted full swing in the setting of his Year 11 school assessment. Seeing as Jack is struggling to gain consistency in his impact with the golf ball, an appropriate performance goal to be implemented is having Jack make successful connection, getting some sort of elevation on the golf ball on at least 3 shots out of every 5. The time parameter set for this goal was 3 weeks, with Jack aiming to practice approximately 3 to 4 hours each week. In order to achieve this goal, the target behaviour for Jack is to maintain correct body posture throughout the swing phases, beginning immediately in the setup phase. Although making successful connection is a simple goal at first, for a player of Jack's ability and the non-linearity of the constraints-led approach, it can be deemed as following Carr's model. If this goal is achieved too easy, it can later be refined to gain consistency in distance, accuracy, and placement. To achieve this performance goal, a constraint must be implemented to correct his knee positioning error and effectively produce a new emergent behaviour. The process goal to achieve this performance goal must therefore be to have Jack maintain optimal or positive knee flexion that's similar to the 156.7 degrees of the professional golfer. After having identified Jack's goals, a constraint was able to be implemented. The first constraint that was applied to address Jack's problem was a task constraint, using the materials of a stool, red tape, 1 golf club, and a golf ball. As Jack began to position himself in his setup, a stool was placed directly behind him, perpendicular to his hitting line. The instruction provided to Jack was to sit down on the seat, no further behind the line of red tape on the edge. However, to ensure Jack didn't stretch his legs out unnecessarily, a golf club was placed on the ground in front of him, for which his feet had to remain behind. Jack was then instructed to take his first swing without the presence of a golf ball. Jack's immediate response to the constraint was that he felt awkward and uncomfortable. This could be explained to Jack lacking the degrees of freedom in his knees and hips as a result of his lack of experience in this proper stance. Although Jack felt uncomfortable, after only 30 minutes using this constraint, it was evident that Jack was learning to self-organize his setup technique after being provided external feedback from the invariant features of the stool and the golf club. His knee flexion positioning was now a lot more biomechanically sound, meaning he was slowly progressing towards his goal. He just needed to connect this with the rest of his swing, and without the presence of the constraint. Hence, this is why the golf ball was then added in. The next week and a half, Jack spent approximately 4 to 5 hours continuing this process of lining up with the constraint and then taking his swing. Jack's knee positioning and his overall body posture had definitely improved over the course of that 1 week. In terms of Jack's goals and his progression in the full swing, Jack was now making successful connection on 4 out of approximately every 5 shots, which was a positive sign. There was one slight moment of regression, however, as Jack was now beginning to position his feet outwards and not parallel with the ball. Although only minor, this emergent behaviour of Jack's was not wanted, which meant a refinement of the original task constraint had to be implemented. The refinement added was placing another 2 golf clubs on either side of Jack's feet. These golf clubs were positioned parallel to the ball, which provided Jack with the necessary feedback to self-organise and make adjustments with his feet. This task constraint proved to be effective, as half a week later, there was enough evidence demonstrating Jack's reliance on the stool constraint was being relinquished, which indicated decaying of the constraint and a new emergent behaviour of Jack flexing his knees. After removing the stool, only the 3 golf clubs were left. Under close monitoring, Jack continued to practice his swing with these golf clubs present for another few days until they were removed for an assessment of his swing. After taking away these final 3 clubs, Jack lined up for the first time without the assistance of constraint. The result was that Jack was now optimizing his setup stance, evident by the flexion of his knees at approximately 140 to 150 degrees. The positioning of his knees shoulder width apart, and now his feet parallel with the ball. This positive stance was an indication of the constraint decaying and a new behaviour emerging as a result. To determine whether this constraint was successful, Jack was again lined up to take his swing and instructed to hit 10 golf balls. The results indicated that Jack made successful connection with 8 golf shots, highlighting that he had successfully achieved his performance goal and was now on his way to achieving the outcome goal of achieving an A in his school assessment.
There are a number of constraints that could be implemented to positively shape Jack's backswing rotation. Using an effective measure is required to achieve Jack's remediation, one of which is the challenging, attainable, realistic, and specific model, or CARS for short, of task and goal setting, can help him achieve his desired outcome goal of getting an A for his end of semester Year 11 assessment. If he is to achieve this goal, his target skill that he needs to be able to perform is a lofted shot from a well-established full swing. In terms of performance, if he is to achieve lofted full swings, aiming to hit a minimum of 4 out of 5 balls with the golf club reaching just above the head is a good performance goal to work towards. Jack has been set 3 to 4 weeks to try and adjust any inconsistencies, with most of his lunch breaks and a minimum of 1 hour to be used for practice after school. To achieve lofted swings, Jack's target behaviour that he needs to focus on is getting the golf club to as close to being above the head as possible, with the club almost adjacent to the ground. Therefore, the process goal in order to achieve this is to ensure Jack rotates the golf club to be behind the head every time he swings. The first constraint that the teacher is showing Jack is a task constraint. Jack is to line up facing the wall and swing normally. Once Jack has swung, the teacher marks how high the rotation in his backswing was. The teacher then shows Jack 2 points that he wants Jack to reach in his backswing, which he will practice over 10 lunch breaks and further on his own after school. Every time Jack makes an improvement on his height and rotation, the teacher marks it on the wall with some red tape. After the first few swings, there was no visible improvement. This is because Jack is still freezing the movement in his shoulders, which is resulting in Jack having little rotation in his backswing. However, after a while, Jack self-organizes himself to make the necessary adjustments to make his backswing higher using the visual feedback represented by the red tape. Over the 10 lunch breaks, Jack slowly progresses to further points on his rotation. Due to the adaptation caused by the constraint, coupled with instability, a new coordination pattern emerges. Eventually, Jack reaches the points on the wall that the teacher has set for him, without any extra cues. This is clear evidence of the constraint decaying, because the behaviour that has emerged is Jack consistently reaching the mark on the wall without any visual feedback. The teacher decided to see Jack perform the task without the guidance of the wall. Although Jack was getting some rotation, he was still falling short of having optimal rotation in his backswing, so the teacher decided to reconfigure the task. To reconfigure the task, the teacher has built an auditory device to help refine the particular behaviour. Like the previous constraint, Jack has 10 lunch breaks and personal time to utilise this constraint. The constraint works similar to the previous in that Jack has to reach a certain point in his rotation with his lead arm, so that the golf club can reach an optimal point. However, instead of a visual cue using the red markings, Jack will know when he has reached the optimal rotation through auditory feedback, when he has hit the dangling utensils. The ball is placed on the ground for Jack to hit so that the constraint is more representative of the performance environment that he will face when doing his assessment. Like the other constraint, Jack needs time to get used to the constraint and is currently inconsistent with his rotation. As time goes on, he begins to attune to key information such as how high his arm needs to go so that the golf club can be rotated enough to hit the utensils. This allows Jack to self-organise himself to make the necessary adjustments to hit the utensils consistently. After a few lunch breaks, Jack is hitting the utensils consistently, so the teacher decides to take away the device. The emergent behaviour visible is Jack being able to produce efficient rotation on his backswing without the aid of the device. The decay of the constraint proved that Jack could produce adequate rotation on his backswing, which helps generate force for the rest of the swing.
An effective way of tracking improvement and progression is going to be through the process of CARS model. An acronym being defined as Challenging, Attainable, Realistic and Specific Goals. An outcome goal was set for Jack in 10 weeks' time, whereby he hoped to perform the target skill of a successfully lofted full swing shot in the task setting on his school oval in front of his fellow peers. Although, in order for Jack to achieve his outcome goal, an appropriate performance goal must be implemented. This performance goal is having Jack improve consistency in the full swing, whereby a visual representation such as a target zone is set up. This target zone provides Jack knowledge of results and knowledge of performance, whereby he can assess his own accuracy and distance. To achieve this performance goal, the following time parameters were utilised. 4 hours of golf practice each week prior to the assessment of his outcome goal. In order for Jack to improve his technique, he needs to create the target behaviour of extending his hips and spine at the right moment and maintaining his head over the ball throughout the whole swing. Using the constraint-led approach, the teacher will make small manipulations to the task Jack is taking part in. The purpose of this is to guide Jack to discovering a helpful coordination pattern. In this task, a task constraint will be utilised, whereby Jack's hat will be manipulated by mounting a laser pointer to it. In this activity, Jack was simply given the device and was told about the safety instructions, as well as the task that he had to complete. The task was to simply hit the golf ball like he had been doing, although this time he had a laser mounted to his hat. In giving implicit instructions about the task, this promotes the learner to attune their movements to the environments, therefore enabling Jack to make intelligent and informed decisions based on a complete understanding of his own capabilities. Firstly, a large laser beam was used which covered a large proportion of the ball. After the first couple of attempts, Jack was still moving his head quite a lot, although this movement was nowhere near as significant as it previously was. It was evident that Jack was making a great deal of effort in order to hold the laser beam over the ball at impact. This constraint is designed to help the student focus on a specific affordance, in this case the laser, that will enable adaptations to occur to his existing technique. This proved to play a pivotal role in Jack's motor systems having the neural biological capacity to self-organise and reattune his coordination pattern to the invariant features of the task constraint at hand. Due to Jack's head being in a much more stabilised position when contact is made, he has limited the premature extension of his hip and back and therefore reduced the vertical shift of his centre of gravity. This emergent behaviour now sees Jack landing 3 out of the 5 balls in the target area, which is a huge improvement towards his performance goal. In order to further improve Jack's downswing and impact phases, the upward movement of his head needs to be eliminated. Jack still moves his head an undesirable amount, and in order to address this, the constraint was refined by using a smaller laser beam. In the first 20 minutes, Jack was finding this refinement rather difficult. It required him to further alter his movements according to the changed task constraint. This refinement required Jack to further put emphasis on holding a stable centre of gravity to avoid moving his head. After attuning his movements and understanding information surrounding his performance, it was now becoming evident that the constraint was beginning to decay. Jack's hitting results improved dramatically from this refinement, and he was now hitting 4 out of the 5 balls into the target zone. Jack was now presenting his swing with a stable head and completely eliminated the vertical shifting of his centre of gravity. As well as this improvement, the predominant weight transference to Jack's back leg prior to impact was no longer prevalent, and the momentum of his swing was much more efficient. Lastly, in order to determine the effectiveness of the constraint, Jack was asked to hit 10 golf balls without the use of the laser device. After hitting 10 golf balls, Jack was delighted that 8 out of the 10 landed in the target zone. Through video footage that was taken, it was able to be analysed that Jack no longer exhibited premature hip and spine extension, and his head was held stable throughout the entire golf swing. This constraint has put Jack in a far better position to transfer the momentum and forces created from his shoulders and trunk into his legs upon impact. This will show direct correlation in Jack's hitting distance as well as his accuracy within his golf swing. Now that it is evident that Jack has reached his performance goal, he is well on his way to achieving the outcome goal of obtaining an A in health and physical education studies.